everyone. My name is Mary Godis, and I am the Program Coordinator for Federal and State Outreach. And thank you so much for coming to our Capitol Hill campus course, A Quarterly Economic Update, January 2010. The Mercatus Center is an economic research and outreach center, and our main goal is to bridge the gap between policymakers and academia with bringing together innovative ideas to practical problems. Before we start our course, I just have a couple announcements. First, the yellow sheet on your chair is a survey. If you would please fill that out before you leave, that would be great. Second, our next event is January 27th, which is next week. Same day as the State of the Union address, and we'll be having a reception. It's called the 2010 Kickoff Reception. It's in the Gold Room, Rayburn 2168. Please stop by. I know some of you watch the State of the Union in your office, so come by right before. We'll have some food and drinks. And then our next Capitol Hill campus course is February 17th. It's titled An Overview of the President's Budget Proposal and Options for Reforming the Budget Process with Veronique DeRuggi, Donald Marin, and Maya McGinnis. It's this flyer that should be on your chair. Okay, now I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dr. Bruce Yandel. He's the Professor Emeritus and BB&T Scholar at Clemson University, where he has been a faculty member since 1969. Dr. Yandel has served in Washington on 2 occasions. He was a senior economist on the President's Council on Wage and Price Stability during the Ford and Carter administrations, and he was the executive director of the Federal Trade Commission during the Reagan administration. He is also the author and co-author of numerous books and articles, including Taking the Environment Seriously and Political Limits of Environmental Regulation. He received his PhD and MBA from Georgia State University and his AB degree from Mercer University. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Yandel.
Thank you very much, Mary. I promised Mary that I was not going to trip over this cord this time, but I will in March. We'll make that a part of the presentation. Let me slip out of my jacket here, and since I'm going to work, thanks for coming today. You and I, of course, live in powerfully interesting and challenging times, to say the least. There's so much that is going on in the world that is frightening and painful. I think it's sometimes helpful to pause for a few minutes on a Friday and celebrate what we have. That is what is going on out there. Kind of puts those things in perspective. But the focus for our conversation is on the economy. What is going on? Let's see if together we can sort out some things and look at what I might describe as an analogy, having lived on the coast when I was growing up. What are those tides doing? That is the tide coming in? And when did it start? What about the eddy currents? If you've lived on the coast, you're very familiar with eddy currents and odd movements in the water when tides are changing. What about those eddy currents? What about the undertow? Is there any dangerous movement in this water as the waters are shifting? And I think the thing that is on everyone's mind as we look at the Great Recession, and what I would say is its ending and the beginning of something else, what is on everyone's mind, I think, is captured in a way in Robert Ariel's cartoon that we see before us, when the man with the pink slip in his pocket is holding up a poster that says lagging indicator. And the folks who are driving by have a quizzical look on their face. And not that they're seeing someone that's unemployed, we understand that, we see a lot of it. But the idea of the lagging indicator. I received an email message this morning, which I do from time to time, and I'm delighted to get them. This was from a journalist in Gaffney, South Carolina. He wrote me and he said, Bruce, I've just gotten the release on the unemployment numbers for South Carolina, and I'm writing a column for tomorrow's paper. How about giving me some ideas about what you think is going on? Now, South Carolina, like many other states, received notice from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that the unemployment rate has gone up. South Carolina's unemployment rate moved up from 12.3%. A little bit of noise there. And if necessary, we can get rid of the whole thing for a moment. You okay? The unemployment rate for South Carolina went up from 12.3% in the previous month, which was November for this data, to 12.6%. And I'm going to turn this off and really...
Number of people who indicated in that survey that they were unemployed and looking for work went down. That is, the looking for work part went down. And so now we have an increase in what is called the discouraged workers, a workforce that is smaller with a higher unemployment rate is worse than a workforce that is larger with a higher unemployment rate. And in a sense, that's an indication of what we have going on in a number of states. South Carolina probably has, I haven't looked at the other data for the other states that came out this morning, but South Carolina probably has the third highest unemployment rate in the nation, or falls right into that category. Now Gaffney, the town where the email came from, is in Cherokee County, South Carolina. They have an unemployment rate of 16%, the official one. The county next to them, just up from them, is Union. It has an unemployment rate of 20%. So we have these high unemployment counties across the country. We'll look at some data. But those numbers are one thing. What we have to keep in mind is we're talking about people. And if all you look at, when we're looking at this Great Recession, if all we look at are numbers, we're going to miss what it's really about, and how the changes can occur, and how painful those changes may be. I had a meeting earlier in the week in Greenville, which is the city nearest where I live, and I was meeting with a man who heads up an organization that is concerned about minority economic development in our area. As I was going to have coffee with him, I passed the Unemployment Security Commission office in that city. It just happened to be the day when the office was there, open up for opportunities to find jobs. There was a line that was a block long. People standing in that line, hoping to find a job. And so we've got the job seekers out there. I have two sons, both are in the construction business in Alabama. One is a painting contractor, one is a drywall contractor. Now, when things get slow, people who previously were going to move to a new home decide we'll paint and fix up the old one. And so one son's business is good. Drywall, that is a new construction business primarily, and so one son has no business at all. And I expected each person in this room to tell us a story about someone close to you, perhaps in your family, or a neighbor, or relative, who is being pinched perhaps rather severely by this Great Recession in terms of employment. Now, as we talk about these things, we want to talk about what are the challenges with respect to the recovery. That is, if the tide is coming in, it is a sort of bumpy tide that we're talking about. So what are some of the challenges as we look at it? When will employment recover? What about what's leading it, and what are the risks? Now, the difficulty with which we are dealing is portrayed in this chart in front of you. All of the, if you can see the blue, all of the blue, This is a copy from a report issued by the White House in the first quarter of this year when the White House was unveiling the stimulus package. And so at that time, the White House said, without a recovery plan, we'll get unemployment of 9% in the year ahead. With the recovery plan, we're going to bring it down to 8%. Now, that was less than a year ago. It was some very bright people, and they are very bright, very able people, put together their projections for what is going on in the economy, and here's the picture. Now, the dots that you see there are the actual numbers. And so what we have is substantially higher unemployment, even higher than the economist at the White House suggested it would be without the recovery plan. And so in my business, they always say if you can't forecast well, you need to forecast often. But that forecast has not been substantially revised, even though it is substantially wrong. But the problem has to do with the data that was being used at the time this was being built. Nothing about any effort to mislead or deceive people. It's the nature of the business we're talking about when we say, well, when is the tide going to come in? Will it come in on a predictable basis the way it has in the past? And what will the flow look like? They missed it. It's not the first time that a group of bright economists missed the forecast. But it's obviously time to revise and regroup as we look at perhaps the most sensitive issue of all, and that is this unemployment number. Now, another way of looking at this data, and I would invite you to look at this, stare at this for a little bit. It looks sort of like spaghetti on the plate with different kinds of sauces that have been mixed in. What we're looking at here is the number of months from the beginning of a recession. There's your 0 point, and then time passes. The number of months from the recession at its start, for us, this one is December of 2007. So you say, okay, we were at the peak then, we started sliding down. And we've been sliding down now for 24 months. So here we are, 24 months later, and that is the percentage loss in employment that has occurred from the peak. And so in the United States, we've lost better than 5% of the labor force employed. There's the point. And now we're comparing to every other recession since World War II. And this helps us to see what this one is like relative to all of the others. Now, the most recent recession relative to this one is right here. That's 2001. And you can see that recession did not generate quite the impact in terms of job losses, but notice the length of that time. And so, in a way, as we look at this shape, as you look at these pieces of spaghetti, in a way, they tend to have a bit of symmetry about them in terms of the decline and hitting a bottom and then recovering. There's a bit of symmetry there. They're somewhat symmetrical. And that enables us to stare at this for a while and make a forecast as to when this thing will begin to get back to the starting point. Anybody want to make a forecast? Do you think it'll happen this year in 2010? Do you think it'll happen by 2011? 2012? You know, the months are ticking off here. You know, as we look at this thing, it looks like it's going to be out here about 4 years or longer before we get back to the high point we were on when we started falling off the economic roller coaster with this recession. And so we've got a lot of pain ahead of us. Yes, sir?
I'm a little bit colorblind, but could you point out which one, the 81-82 recession?
All right.
Is that the nearest comparable
81-82 is right here. Okay. Any other questions? The colors are not real good, even if you're not colorblind. Now, another way to look at this, same problem, and I'm emphasizing the employment part of the problem because the employment part of the problem is the problem for people. That's what it's about. It is, when is it going to get better? This is total employment. This is monthly data. This is data that comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics household survey. So every month there are telephone calls that are made across America, and out of that comes the state data I referred to earlier. The data here begin in 1991, and we come all the way out to December of this past year. And there you can see the hole that has been carved as a result of this Great Recession. I've run a trend line through the data just to show what the gap looks like, so that as you look at this data, you can see those times which were better than average, lots of them in the middle of the chart, and a lot right in here, and then this severe decline that we're talking about. Now, if we were to stare at that last observation and say, okay, I can see where that is, how does it compare looking back? Okay, there's the answer. We're about where we were in total employment in the nation. We were about where we were in September of 2003. So we've got 6 years of loss in terms of total employment. Did you have a hand up?
Yeah, does your number include people who are part-time employed, or are these just full-time?
This is full-time.
Okay.
This is just full-time. And so if you begin to add those other features, it's a very, very different picture. In fact, let me pick up on your question. If you take the total unemployed and add to it the discouraged workers, that is those who are no longer looking, and then if you add to it those who are part-time but wanted to have a full-time job, the big number that you get for the U.S. economy is 25 million. 25 million people who are out of work or either not working as hard as they would like. Now, relative to our total population, you say, well, that's a big number, but we're a big bunch of people. It happens to be the number that is equal to the high unemployment in 1933, in the depths of the Great Depression. That is, we've got the total number unemployed, as I qualified the definition, that were present in 1933. In 1933, the Bureau of Labor Statistics was not turning out data so that we could have a comparable. But in a sense, we have a number, a magnitude that compares with the Great Recession in terms of total. But we have a much larger population, a much larger economy, and I would say much better equipped to deal with that number than we were then. When we look at employment growth, one of the measures that is sometimes helpful is a measure called the diffusion index. The diffusion index is an attempt to measure the number of sectors in the economy that are adding jobs relative to the number of sectors that are throwing off employment. The magic number is 50. 50 in the chart, for those of you who are sort of back in the back, is about the second line down from the top. That's 50. And here's the most recent observation. I punched that in Tuesday from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's less than 50, but you can see that we are bouncing along a not very smooth path. Here's where the diffusion index hit its lowest level, where 80% of the sectors were losing jobs. There's 20. And now we're headed up towards 50. We're not there yet, but it's a bumpy path. Now, you know, in a way we say, well, why is the path so bumpy? What is it that generates those bumps? And why is it that it's so hard to get back to 50? And what about other parts of the United States? That is, it's bumpy in different places, but not so bumpy in other places. This map shows the unemployment rate by state. Upper left-hand corner, that's July of 2009. This is November of 2009. That's the most recent map data. I show you those so that you can sort of see where some states are clawing their way back in terms of the recovery. That is, some things have brightened up a bit. It's awfully hard to see it in these projections, but you see the states, these three right in here, that are still much lighter in color, which means lower unemployment rates than the rest. If you stared real hard at this, you would see probably New Hampshire and Connecticut lightening up a bit. Virginia, nothing else. East of the Mississippi River, Illinois is showing a little bit of improvement there from a very low level. But the geography of the recovery is a very different thing from what the big number suggests to us. You can see how heavily hard hit the West Coast is. The states that are showing the strongest pulse beat, let's call it that, generally speaking, are states that have something going on with respect to energy production. Either ethanol, coal, oil, or something related to it. The strength of the U.S. economy, we'll look at some other things later, the strength of the U.S. economy, aside from the recession, the strength of the economy is west of the Mississippi River. That's where the great strength has been for quite some time. That's nothing new. That's where the growth in employment is greatest. That is where a lot of things lead to or rise relative to east of the Mississippi River. Well, when we talk about those bumpy paths and look at the data on unemployment, when we look at that data comparing the loss of employment since 1948 for every recession, we saw paths, some of them were V-shaped, some were kind of W-shaped, some were sort of U-shaped, all of them were kind of bumpy. And so it gets to be a question with respect to the recovery, will we get a V, come down, hit the bottom, bounce back up fairly quickly? Will it be a U, come down, run along a trough? How long is the trough? Start coming back up. Will it be a W, come down, oh boy, it feels like things are getting better. Oops, here we go again, we're going back down. Will we get a W? Or will this thing be shaped sort of like a caterpillar? Not real neat, not a nice, neat geometric figure, and somewhat unpredictable. And I'm going to suggest to you that the recovery is a caterpillar. Not only is it somewhat unpredictable in terms of its shape, but the darn thing changes its shape while we are in the path of recovery. So what is it that's giving us this sort of caterpillar-like look to the recovery? Here's what's standing in the way, fundamentally. And when I say standing in the way, let me qualify. Standing in the way of what? What we are looking for, I would suggest, is what we might call the 90% solution. The 90% solution to the problem that we have called the Great Recession. I call it the 90% solution because we have about, at the national level, 10% unemployment. When we have 10% unemployment, that means 90% of those people in the workforce looking for work have a job. And so we are a 90% employed economy. And you can play with the definitions and all that, but that's where I'm coming from when I say the 90% solution. The ultimate solution to the recovery will have to come from that economy that is out there where people just go to work every day and they make stuff and perform services and engage in transactions with their neighbors, and they're creating wealth. In the meantime, the 10% is the part that really disturbs us. And efforts to do something to smooth over, to salve the pain associated with the 10%, generates a system of off and on switches. So the bigger the bowl of salve that we put out, the larger it is, the more apt it will generate an effect, but that effect will not be real. It will be stimulus relative to the 90% economy. Now, that's not suggesting that the effect will not be helpful. It's just saying it will generate a bumpy path as we find our recovery. And so, now the question is, what's real and what's stimulus? But I mean, who cares? Who cares what's real and what's stimulus? Who do you think cares? Every week, I hear about a small business in my area. A lot of times it's a restaurant. Been in business a long time, where they're shutting down. They're throwing in the towel. And in some cases, sending the keys to the establishment to the bank. In other words, they say, we're out of here. Every week, there are people in business who say, if this thing just turns around in the next few months, I will not have to shut down. Every week there are people who are saying, should we add to our inventories to prepare for an increase in consumer activity or not? Part of the answer is what we're feeling right now real, or is it stimulus? If it's stimulus, how long is it going to last? What's real? And what is stimulus? Now let's go back, because I was suggesting to you that the thing that stands in the way of the recovery is what we're looking at here. What you're seeing there is the level of total savings for the United States economy. That's every nickel, dime, and dollar that is saved on an annual basis, an annual rate by the American economy. In the middle of the chart, you see 2005, where it hit a pretty low level, getting close to 100 billion. That's billion, not trillions. $100 billion of total savings for the U.S. economy. Then this recession hits. Whammo! Savings starts going to the sky. Now, most of this is not it's not money in CDs and passbook savings account or cookie jars or wherever you're going to put it. It's paying off credit card debt. When you pay off debt, you're saving. So what we see here is primarily paying off debt. It's gone to the sky. Give me a word that you think would describe a population of people you're observing in terms of their saving habits. And you're watching this population of people, and you're seeing them move along, move along, move along, and then all of a sudden you see this. What word would you say you would choose to characterize the behavior? What's going on? One word.
Fear.
Okay, fear. Fear. Uncertainty. What's real? What's stimulus? That's part of where it's going. Incentives matter powerfully here. And so folks who are saying, honey, we better cut back a little bit. You know, we used to go out for dinner on Friday. We were stamping out home cooking, and it felt so good. Well, we're going to be cooking at home again. And I'll be picking out my favorite recipes, and we'll have a good time. We're cutting back because that credit card balance is worrying us. That's it. And so there's a restaurant then that folds, not because of one family, but because of a lot of people who said, we're not going to be going out on Friday night. Now, if you look at this, you'll see this is beginning to turn down. That is, the savings is way up there. It's beginning to turn down. As it turns down, that's somebody who says, well, maybe once a month we can go out for dinner. But we won't go to the high-end restaurants. We'll go to McDonald's, and we'll get a Happy Meal for the children. But it will still have the fun of kind of going out. So as this thing begins to turn down, then some retail activity begins to get generated. But there are questions. Is what is going on real, or is it temporary? Now, a real aspect of behavior for people who are employed is the number of hours they work. As recessions go forward and it begins to feel a little bit better for employers, they generally do not call back people who lost their jobs and say, I got good news for you. You can start back Monday. The first thing they typically do is to the current workforce to say, we're going to be working a few more hours next week. So the average length of the work week begins to go up. Now, if you were the employer who had just a year ago had to terminate some of your best people, not because they were not performing, but because business was poor, if you were that person who had to terminate some of your best people, you can understand that they don't want to do that again if they can afford it. Now, it is most painful for the person losing the job. Let's not forget that. But when you're the person that terminates, that's not a lot of fun either. When I was executive director of the Federal Trade Commission, I was involved in terminating 150 people in our regional offices. And that was a time of big deficits in Washington, and we were under orders to cut back. It was not fun to do that. It was far more painful for the people than it was for me. I wanted to do it right. But I did not want to find the agency in the throes again. In other words, if we're going to do it, let's do it right the first time. Let's don't impose this pain on us next year as well. I was in business for 15 years. And during those years, a number of recessions came along, and I had to terminate people, and I would put that off as long as I could because it's so painful. All right, enough. When you've got a manager sitting out there trying to decide, am I going to bring someone back full time? Then let's put it off. We'll increase the number of hours. Well, what's the second thing I will do if things continue to sort of pick up? I will hire some temporaries. I will go to a labor supply firm like Manpower Incorporated and say, hey, I need 5 more people next week from you. We'll hire them 1 day at a time, 1 week at a time, under contract from you. And then if things continue to go, you begin to say, okay, maybe it's safe to go back into work and to add workers. Now, what I've just described to you is why unemployment is a lagging indicator of economic recovery. It is because of that kind of behavior where people say, I want to be real sure. Meanwhile, the economy is recovering. You got those longer work weeks. You have those additional part-time workers. They're turning out stuff. And if that continues, you've got more output. Now let's look at part of the stimulus and the thing that makes it difficult for the people out there who are making these decisions to know what's going on. I'm showing you data on pending home sales for the U.S. The different colors are for different regions of the U.S. And here you see these bars that shoot up in October of 2009. Does anybody know what took place in October of 2009 that would make all those bars shoot up? Did people just wake up one day and say, wow, I think it's time to buy a house? What was going on? First-time home buyers, what? Tax credit, did you remember what it was? $8,000. Knock it off your income tax this year. If you haven't bought a home before and you go out and you find an existing home for sale, whammo, have you got a deal. And a lot of people, incentives matter. And people said, wow, it's not going to get any better than that, and mortgage rates kind of low, and the good old FHA is tooling up, and now we only have to have 5% down, and whammo, we got a deal. And so typically what happens when you get a spurt, it's borrowing from the future. There's November. And so my son, who's down there in the drywall business, is looking. I said, hey, Eric, take a look at building permits. He lives in Auburn, Alabama. Take a look at building permits that are being issued for the county and see what's going on. And Eric says, not a lot. And I said, well, what about houses? Are they moving? Yeah, they're moving, but I think it's just stimulus. Is it real or is it stimulus? That's autos. Here's automobiles. That's monthly sales on vehicles on an annual basis. There's the cash for clunker. Big time increase. If you were an auto dealer, would you say, I'm going to make my plans on the basis of calling back people on the basis of those sales? Heaven no. But it mattered. It mattered. It generated income. It generated orders. It moved inventory. In that sense, it was real. But that's the month afterwards. Now, I invite you to stare at this a little bit because there's some really good news in this chart. Those last 3 observations. Those last 3 observations are real, not stimulus, and they're headed north. Remember, the savings started turning down, which says consumers are getting a little more encouraged about spending, and one of the things they are buying is automobiles, and we see the sales showing up here in this chart. Now, a couple of items of very good news. I warn you, I've told you this before, those of you who've been to our quarterly updates, my mother loved me an awful lot when I was little. There was never any doubt in my mind about that, and that has always caused me to be optimistic. And so, in a way, it's a warning. Sometimes you have to be cautious when you're around someone who's an optimist. You say, what's really going on out there? Because an optimist might put a kind of positive spin on something that may not deserve it. But I'll be honest with you, I would rather be around an optimist anytime than a pessimist. But it would be better to be accurate. It would be better to be asked. But what we have here is some very, very strong news. We do not get data on the entire U.S. economy, other than the most frequent is quarterly. We get quarterly data on the total economy. We get monthly data on what we might call the factory economy. That comes from the Federal Reserve. There's a private organization that generates data every month for the entire economy, and it's a company or organization called the Institute of Supply Management. And they've been doing this a long time. In fact, they've been doing it probably since the 1930s. But on the basis of survey of purchasing directors nationwide, they ask a number of questions about production, backlogs of orders, what's happening to prices of inputs, lots of questions. And they generate an index, two indices. One is for the manufacturing economy, and one is for what they artfully call the non-manufacturing economy. Let's call it the services economy. It's everything else. Now, everything else is the biggest part of our economy. That's about 75% of it. The manufacturing economy is about 25% of it's producing that much of GDP on a regular basis. So it's big, but it's not the main part of our economy. Again, you have a magic number. The magic number is 50. When their index is at 50, nothing is happening. The economy is dead in the water. It's not shrinking. It's not expanding. And so if you will look back with me to February of 2009, just about a year ago, their number was 36, way down from 50. And so here's the path that has been traveled as the manufacturing economy begins to tool up for activity from a low level. And notice the manufacturing economy broke 50 in July, and there's your caterpillar. It kind of moves up and down. What do you suppose caused that little mountain right there in October? Want to make a guess? This is the manufacturing economy that they make automobiles. That's cash for clunkers. Cash for clunkers generated a little bit of a mountain there in the production data for the manufacturing economy, and then cash for clunkers went away, and now we've got cash for appliances. It's not doing nearly as well as the cash for clunkers, and we've got cash for caulkers. We have other kinds of stimulus activities, but nothing is as big as that clunker deal. But so the caterpillar popped up and then came back down, but above 50, we've got an expanding manufacturing economy, and I would suggest to you that's powerful, good news for the U.S. economy. Now let's look at the rest of the economy, and that's your chart right here. Again, you see a similar path as the services economy begins to improve. We break through 50. We get some of those home sale activities. Then, whoops, here we go again. We've got a W on our hands, folks. We pop back down, but then coming back up. The most recent observation is 50.8. So we're back above 50, barely, from a very low level. But this gives you an idea of the path that has been followed for the national economy. And I would suggest to you again, this is powerful good news. If you want to send some good news to someone you love, tell them about the Institute for Supply Chain Management. They will love you for it. So write a letter home and tell them. When we translate all of this into GDP growth, the colors are not real clear, but the stuff that's already happened is black. This is orange, these last few bars. The orange bars represent an image of what I think this year's activity is going to look like. Notice that all those bars are positive in positive territory. If you average out these bars, it's about 2.5% GDP growth in the year we are in. And again, there's the cash for clunkers. No, sorry. Yes, cash for clunkers. That bar really went up. Better than half of it was generated by cash for clunkers. That was one more big program. We sold 700,000 automobiles in that program. And here's another bar that's above zero, where around it is this recessionary stuff. Does anybody remember what was going on back there? Late in 2008. Somebody remember the very first stimulus effort? The very first stimulus effort, those checks showed up in the mailbox. Do you remember what the checks were for? How much? About 150 bucks, something like that. Anyhow, that's that bar. That's what's stimulus, right here. Then, no more checks, whammo, economy sinks. Clunkers, wow. Now we're bouncing. And so there's our caterpillar shape as we bounce along, partly because of the magnitude of the stimulus programs that have affected the GDP. All right, I've talked about this in terms of the steps that might follow when we are generating this recovery, when the tide is coming in. The first thing is that equity markets move up. All of a sudden your portfolio is looking a lot prettier than it did this time last year. Your 201k is becoming a 301k and a 401k again before it's all over. On average, you've recovered 30% from the bottom when everything seemed to be coming to an end. And the equity markets have forecasted the recovery for 10 of the last 6 recessions in the United States. In other words, the equity markets don't forecast perfectly. Nothing does. So we have to be cautious. But the equity markets are sending some pretty big signals. Then the work hours go up, firms become profitable, employment increases, personal income begins to rise. Sort of the process that we're talking about. One of the fears, that is, as we say, okay, what are the risks out there? Tell us about the alligators in the water. What are the risks out there? And one of the risks is inflation. It's a powerful risk. And we've got some powerful people doing this, whipping at it, saying, we know how to handle this beast, just give us a chance. In order to appreciate the risk, you might have known, you come to an economics lecture and every now and then you have to pay the price. You have to pay the price, you have to see one equation at least. But if the equations really make you feel bad on a wonderful Friday, just kind of close your eyes and tune out and send a text message to somebody you love. Because what we have here is a kind of logical statement. The logical statement says, an economy that relies on money, ours does, all right? Every modern economy in the world has a circulating currency. And if we were to peel out our pocketbooks and purses in here and put the amount of currency we have with us, and then if we were to tell the truth about our checking account balances, and we added that all up, if we were one economy and we added all of that up, that would be M for our economy. The amount of money that we can supply as consumers, cash and demand. That's one measure of the money supply. And so for an economy, the amount of money that it has to translate into the value of what it does. And how that money gets translated depends on how fast we can move it from one person to another as we're buying and selling and investing. As that money moves, it's generating activity. And as it generates activity, over on the other side of the equal sign is Q. That's output. Multiplied by the average price of the output. So, money multiplied by how fast it moves is equal to the value of the output generated in a time period by this economy. Now, if M shoots up real fast, and if V doesn't change real fast, airplane flies over, drops out money, we run out of the yard, pick it up, stick it in our pockets, and run in the house and say, honey, let's go shopping. And everybody says, honey, let's go shopping. And we all end up at Walmart at the same time with our new money. Walmart hasn't gotten more stuff. And all of a sudden Walmart says, what in the world is going on? We've got more people in here trying to buy than we've ever had. Raise the prices, Charlie. And so the prices start rising. And the stimulus for the price increase was the money that fell into our pockets. And so in a very short period of time, when M flies up, P tends to fly up. During World War II, our B-29s, B-17s flew over Germany, dropping out bales of money. Whose money? their money, carefully counterfeited. Why in the world would we give the German people money so that we could destroy their economy through inflation? Now, our Federal Reserve does that. But they don't do it with airplanes. Our Federal Reserve does that. And we'll explain why they do it. They might do it with an airplane if they thought that it would help us to recover from this recession. I'm telling Dot, you stay out in the backyard, honey. One of those green planes may be coming. All right, now, we're not going to dwell on this equation anymore. You've paid the price, so let's move forward. What you're seeing here is the growth of money in our economy. There are lots of different definitions, different ways to define money depending on what we include in it. One of those is called M1 by the Fed. M1 is cash plus demand prices. We're going back to 2000, January. We're coming forward to, I believe that's October of last year. And so you see the money supply going up and down, up and down, up and down. Here's zero. Look at this. Wow! What in the world is that? That's 9/11, my friends. When 9/11 occurred, the Federal Reserve actually leased U-Haul trucks, loaded them with money, and sent those trucks out into the banking system because there was the expectation that a lot of ordinary people were going to go to their banks and say, I don't know what's happening, but I want to draw some cash out of my checking account to make sure I don't run out of money. Now, we have a fractional reserve banking system. And we all know that everybody cannot pull their money out simultaneously. There just is not that much money. So as soon as 9/11 was sort of over and we realized the world's not coming to an end, what did the Fed do? Bring the trucks back. They pulled the money back. Well, why? Why didn't they just leave it? Remember the equation? MV is equal to PQ. If they had left it in the banking system, banks said, well, we've got more reserves, let's lend the money out. Lend the money out, more people can buy. More people can buy. Wait a minute, what are they going to buy? Don't worry about that. Inflation will start creeping up as money was increased. Now, there's a lag between throwing money out there and what people do with it, other than in a crisis situation like 9/11 would suggest. And the lag on average is 9 months long. It takes 9 months to create a baby. It takes 9 months to create an economy with a shot of money. So, you throw money out, 9 months later, GDP goes up on average. All right, now, here's where we are now. The Fed was worried about the inflation economy. They're not going to admit it because they may not have recognized it. There's a big debate about that. But let's just say that they recognized interest rates have been too low too long. And so we're going to compensate by that, by putting our foot on the brakes. And they did. And the money supply went down and interest rates went up. And we generate the beginning of a recession. Then when they realized that the economy was really slowing down and things were really collapsing, call Joe and tell him to open the big valve. They opened the big money valve, called the printing office and tell them to print more money. And for the first time in our modern history, the chairman of the Federal Reserve said, we are printing money. I never in my lifetime heard a chairman of the Fed admit that we're just printing money. And that's what we have been doing, and we've printed money, and there it is, way up there. And they're not pulling it back in. Why not? Now this is part of the debate that is going on right now. President Obama yesterday says, those blasted banks, they don't get it. What don't they get? In a way, they stand between this recovery and consumers. There's a bottleneck out there. They are not lowering their rates on credit cards. They're not consumer friendly. They're giving themselves big bonuses. And we bailed them out. That's money. We loaded them down with money. Why don't they lend? Well, there's something called the Comptroller of Currency, and the auditors from the Comptroller of Currency visit every bank almost every month in the United States, and they're beating the bankers over the head saying, you're making loans to people who are not creditworthy, cut it out. And you have the FDIC coming and auditing those same banks saying, you've got to be more careful who you lend to. Every banker I talk with says, you know, we have an odd thing. We've got a lot of reserves, but we can't find anybody we can lend to who is creditworthy because the regulators will not let us. Well, it's probably a good thing that the regulators won't let them. But then we have Washington saying, these evil bankers, why don't they lend? Are there elements of truth in both arguments? That's the question, yes.
I guess how much of that is also influenced by the fact that the banks were over-leveraged themselves, which got us into the financial crisis,
Yeah.
so they're trying to
Yeah, it is a deleveraging activity.
Okay.
It is a deleveraging activity. But there were probably 4 or 5, maybe 10 banks that were, that you might, using your words, got us in trouble. I kind of doubt that it's any of the community banks in South Carolina, for example, or in your state, but they're not able to lend either. And some of them are hurting too in terms of their reserves because of what they're having to write off from the recession. The main point I'm trying to make here is that what we've got is a backlog of money. And now I ask you, well, what if everybody said Obama's right and the Comptroller of Currency says the president is right? Open up the loans. Get that money out there in the hands of the people. Suppose they all did that starting this Monday. What would happen? All of that M comes into the economy. Anybody want to hazard a guess? If you go back to the equation of exchange, what's the forecast? If all that M really does come out the door, and they say, you wanted to buy an automobile, you applied for a loan, approved. You want to build some apartments, you applied for a loan, approved. If all those loans started getting approved, now there would be a lag. The fear of inflation would be there. And so if we got inflation, what's the Federal Reserve going to do? They're going to raise interest rates. And if they raise interest rates, what's going to happen to the recovery? All right, that's the dangerous game that everybody's playing. And those who are playing it know it. And they know it with far more information than I would ever be able to put together. But they know the dimensions of this game, and it's a high risk in terms of the recovery. Now, what I'm showing you here, I have mapped money supply growth into industrial production for the nation with a 9-month lag. And this just basically tells us that historically we're able to predict the level of economic activity and growth if we know money supply 9 months ago. We know money supply now. There it is, way up there. Can we forecast GDP growth 9 months from now that says we're going to see an explosion in GDP as we go forward? I sort of think not. And then that suggests that as we go forward, the Fed will have to figure out a way to get that money out of the economy the way they did after 9/11. Now, I mentioned that one of the first steps is the equity markets go up. What I'm showing you here is growth in equity markets year over year for the major equity markets in the world. This data comes out of the Economist magazine. You get it every month. And so recently I took the Economist magazine and I said, okay, I'm going to look at the percentage change in equity markets around the world. This is from December through October the 28th, over a year. Here we are, December 2007 to October 2009, almost 2 years. And here's my portfolio over here. All right. That's the U.S. Standard & Poor's, where we say, hey, isn't this great? Our economy is booming again. And then somebody says, whoa, have you looked at Brazil? What about Chile? What about China? What about everywhere else? In other words, we've got a recovery showing up, but we are the pikers in the world. The new investment in the world is not being made here. Replacement investment is being made here. And so if you want to be a player in the world, you need to be playing in the Czech Republic, in Denmark, in Hungary, in Sweden, in Australia, in Hong Kong, in India, so on and so forth. That's the growing part of the world economy in terms of what investors worldwide say. These are the people who are placing their bets with their own money as they buy and sell shares of stock. In other words, we are a very mature economy. Let's put it another way. We are a very mature economy, and so is Japan, and so is Britain, and so is Canada. Canada's doing a lot better than we are, by the way. So we got problems. We've got a recovery being generated, but it's not happening here. But when it happens over there, what does that do for us? So what? This is real, a reflection of reality. This is financial. It's a reflection of reality. And if those investors are right, there's a forecast here. I think I've told you all before, I live in an old house that's a half a block from a major railroad that runs through our area. I rode that train up here last night before last. It's one of the few last surviving operations where passengers can get on a train and go somewhere. So I walk across the railroad tracks, get on the train, and I come to Union Station. It's pretty convenient. If you got plenty of time, you can usually forecast arrival with greater accuracy now than with flying by air. So there are more people riding on the train, perhaps, than there have been for a while. But there are a lot of freight trains. There are about 15 or 20 trains that pass our house every day in a 24-hour period. All but one, they are freight trains. And so what we see are the goods being shipped by America to the rest of the world, and goods being shipped by the rest of the world to America. So we get to see a cross-section. I love to sit on my porch and count the cars. It's an estimate of what's happening to exports. And so when Brazil is picking up, and Argentina and Venezuela and so forth, I see more of those Caterpillar tractors on flat cars going out to the world. We export big stuff. We do not export much in the way of consumer goods. We export big stuff. Big diesel engines, big tractors, big servers, big items. Sometimes we as consumers have the idea that America no longer produces anything because we don't see it when we go shopping. I do think that an automobile produced here is something, but most everything we produce in the U.S. is big stuff, big industrial stuff. And so while we have this going on, it is stimulating. Lock that back to our discussion of the factory economy. The factory economy in the U.S. is beginning to show a response, primarily because of what the rest of the world is doing, not what we are doing here. This is a map. This one is generated in October of 2009. It gives you an idea on state-by-state identification of where a state is with respect to the recession. And only one state is now left, still in a recession. And the blue ones are recovering, and the rest are moderating. They are coming back, clawing their way out of the grave, but they're making progress. It gives you a picture. And so you can find your own state. In a sense, this is data that is generated by economy.com, and what they're looking at are patterns of employment and patterns of industrial production for each of the states. But what about brains? What do brains have to do with this thing? This is the unemployment rate based on educational attainment. The data is for December. On average, people with bachelor's degrees in the United States, the unemployment rate is 5%. It's powerful good news for people who have bachelor's degrees. And probably every one of us can say, oh, but I know somebody who has a bachelor's degree that is unemployed. Yep, that's one of the 5%. Do you know anybody who has less than a high school education? The unemployment rate for those is 15.3. If you take the weighted average of the educational characteristics of your state, as if you go to Bureau of Census, American Survey, you can get the educational attainment characteristics of your state. If you multiply those characteristics by these numbers, you can forecast fairly accurately the unemployment rate in your state. That's not the entire story, but it's pretty accurate. The unemployment story is a story about brains. It is pure and simply a story about educational attainment. There's more to the story, but that's the big part of the story. And so as we have these recessions and things change, then the prospects for the future change. That is, we're generating a new economy. It's not going to be the one that we fell off the top as we go forward. A colleague and I have been building indices, state indices, one of which measures the knowledge economy. So we've built an index and we generate a number for each of the 50 states. The number we generate is driven by educational attainment, weighted by the share of the population in that state, expenditures on research and development, and fast growth firms. Whereas that's an index for the extent to which a state is a burgeoning knowledge economy. A number of years ago, we built an index called the Economic Freedom Index. There are 4 or 5 of those being produced now. The Economic Freedom Index has contained in it 135 variables, of which some have to do with how many permits do you have to get to start a business in this state versus another state. What is the level of taxation? What is the representation required in terms of attorneys in order to do business in a state? Those different kinds of things. And so now we've got a number for economic freedom and a number for knowledge economy. And what I've mapped here is to show you how the states get arrayed with respect to these indices rankings. That is, we generate rankings 1 to 50. In the southwest corner are states that have high knowledge economy rankings and high economic freedom rankings. Which those are the states by the rankings that are strongest in terms of their future prospects for growth. There are 4 states, if I remember right, east of the Mississippi River, in this ranking right in here. Well, there's Delaware, there's Georgia, New Hampshire, and Virginia. So here would be the forecast for high growth for the future. Now you can get over here very close to the borderline. There's Texas, another strong state. Nebraska's right on the boundary. There's Illinois, there's Minnesota. Up in the upper right hand, up in the northeast corner of those states that rank lowest on knowledge economy, that's educational attainment primarily, the states that rank lowest on that score, and lowest in terms of economic freedom, those are the states that will likely lag. That is, the further they are to the northeast in this array, the slower will be their future prospects for growth, determined primarily, I would say, by educational attainment. And so as this economy is coming out of this recession, it's not the economy that went into the recession. It's a new gain being generated. And that new gain has some really interesting characteristics. For example, the sectors of our economy that are contracting most are dominated primarily by male workers, construction and manufacturing. The sectors of our economy that are expanding most are dominated primarily by female workers, education, healthcare services, and government. Now in the U.S., there are more women employed than men in the labor force, and that is going to continue. Not only will it continue, the average earnings for women will be rising while the average earnings for men will be falling. And so there's a new game in town being driven by the knowledge economy and the educational attainment characteristics of the population. And these are things that will change the way we live. Our customs and traditions will be changing, not just because of the recession. So unemployment destroys wealth, but it creates opportunity. There are even odds in a Great Depression or a recession that there will be as many new businesses started as would be started during times of prosperity. Why? In other words, we're getting an explosion of entrepreneurship. Now, why? A bunch of bright people with a lot of ability lost their jobs. And after a while, first you try to get a job like the one you lost. That's your first response. Second response, they're not any. Well, then let's move somewhere where there may be. It's another response. But a third response is, well, I better try to figure out another way to make a living. There's a category of firms in the U.S. called non-employer firms. Those are firms with no employees. You can't be an employer without an employee. Now I'm giving you Bureau of Labor Statistics jargon. It's called a non-employer firm. 75% of the firms in the U.S. have no employees. 75%. In your congressional offices or Senate offices, how many calls do you get from firms that don't have any employees? They don't have much representation. Who has time to call? You know, I'm it. Go to Starbucks sometimes and look around, and you will see some people with laptops and cell phones. You may be looking at the chairman of the board, president, and only worker of a non-employer firm. In one of the counties I analyzed recently near Charlotte, North Carolina, York County, South Carolina, they have 14,000 non-employer firms in that county. They have 4,400 firms with employees. 4,400 firms with employees, that's your traditional firm. 14,000 firms. And when I was talking with the people, they said, where are they? And I said, I don't know. They don't have offices. They're not in buildings. They don't get out in lobby. The Bureau of Labor Statistics will tell you what they do. And one of the largest categories of those firms are people in software development, business consulting, and financial management. Unemployment generates more of that. And a lot of those will fail. But a lot of them will become sort of the Microsofts of the future and other things. And so we're generating a new world out there as we go forward. This just summarizes the outlook. I mentioned the 2.5% GDP growth, which is what I expect this year will sort of average out. I also identify some of the risks. I've mentioned some of those primarily focusing on inflation. Last time we were together, I can't remember what month that was, Mary. It must have been in December.
September.
Yeah, September. This is close to December, isn't it? This is January. I got that month right. It was in September. So 3 months ago, we had these three choices on a sheet for the people who attended to identify what they thought might be taking place as we went forward. And below the items are the number of people who selected the particular options. And notice that 19 people selected number 3. This was the view back in September. Hey, we've got a double-dip recession. It's a caterpillar economy. We talked about that. 1 month looks good, the next not so good. The economy does seem to be generating positive growth. The Dow seems hung at 9,500. Unemployment is stuck at 9.5. Back-to-school spending in the basement. Prospects for Christmas spending are bleak. It turned out that way, my friend. Banks are struggling with bad commercial debt. Bank failures continue to plague the economy. Forecasters are revising their forecast downward. That was a pretty good summary. The 9,500 on the Dow wasn't real good. Thank goodness. That we picked up about 1,000 points. We're losing by the hundreds every day now, but we picked up about 1,000. Yeah. But that was the main choice. These are choices that I wanted to ask you to think about. If you'll take the time to pick one of these before you pull out, I would appreciate it. I sort of like the second one, Caterpillar be damned. All right? That's because my mother loved me a lot, so caution you there. But if you would take a look at these, and by the way, the sell-off that is taking place on the equity markets, it began the day before yesterday, I believe is driven primarily by China's action. It is the Chinese leaders of China announced that, hey, our economy has recovered, and now we are worried about inflation, and we're going to put a lid on growth. So what we see, of course, there are always a lot of big blocks that are falling in the pool on a daily basis, particularly during times like these. But I think that is what is happening right now that's knocking the equity markets for a loop. This one has that. They put a lid on GDP growth and change the demand for our products. Sometimes people say, what on earth do we sell to China? If you're from an agricultural state, you know. Because we are a big exporter of agricultural products to China. So that's going to be weakening there. But if you would take a look at these, while you're doing that in the next few minutes, questions, things I didn't brush up against it. Anybody? Yes, ma'am.
One quick announcement.
Yes, please.
Please fill out the survey before you leave. That would be great, as well as his predictions.
Okay. Question here and over here. Yes.
Any outlook on the housing market?
Outlook on the housing market. We are seeing housing permit growth, significant growth now from a low level. It says housing permit growth from a low level. There is an index called the Case-Shiller Index, which measures the average price for homes sold for 20 metropolitan areas in the U.S. That index is now turning up. That is the average price. Things have stabilized, is the point, instead of prices continuing to fall. And so the evidence suggests that the housing market has bottomed, but it's going to be a long bottom. Now, there are parts of the housing market that have far more distance to travel going down than other parts. There is significant overbuilding at the high end. In a lot of areas, in a lot of markets, there is high-end housing. I'm talking about housing that sells for $1 million or $500,000. That's high-end. There's a lot of that is sitting out there that's not going to be occupied for a long, long time until they really cut the prices. There's a lot of housing that was built in the wrong places. But in terms of the housing market, what we might think of as starter homes, first homes, that kind of thing, is growing. There are more permits being issued for multifamily than for single family in a lot of markets, and so that's a stronger piece. Yes, sir. Over here.
So you have a mention of the commercial property market.
Yes.
In number 2.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what might happen in the coming year?
Okay. All right. This relates to this question over here. That is, to a large extent, the credit market meltdown, the collapse that we are also familiar with, was related to housing primarily, and then it gets translated into credit card debt, lots of other things, primarily consumer-driven and developer-driven in the interest of producing houses for consumers. And so, as I say, it'll all come out in the wash, as I mentioned, but it's hell going through the ringer. We've sort of gone through the ringer on that part of the economy, but then people say there's another shoe left to drop. If you look at the balance sheets of the banking system, there's a lot of debt out there now still left that is primarily in the commercial category. Now, a lot of that has already triggered revaluations, deleveraging, cutting back, taking the licks. That is, as banks are announcing their earnings, the big ones are doing it. They started 2 days ago, and it's continuing right now. This is the season for that. A lot of them have already written down a lot of this commercial stuff. But there is more that is there. It is large. And I think the question has to do with, will the tide come in fast enough to prevent a second dip that might come from the commercial side of the balance sheet? I don't have a guess on that. All I would say is that it's a potential double whammy. And to some extent, the Fed's pumping that money and those extra reserves out there represents a shock absorber for this. But it is large. It suggests that there are going to be more bank failures. That is, that's not over. Consolidations and mergers, shotgun weddings for some banks brought about by the regulators, and so forth. There will be more of that to come. Another question? Yes, sir.
Just regarding the concept you're talking about with personal savings, and obviously
yes.
It helps drive consumer spending if you see it
yes.
dropping, but do you personally think that we have a healthier long-term economy if we keep the savings a little higher than we have in the past?
I think what we will see will be a higher level of savings. Let's call it the new equilibrium. I don't think the new equilibrium will look like the old equilibrium. I sort of have the feeling, and I'm sure you may have a difference of opinion, or you may have the same one, that there's a lot of fundamental change in human behavior associated with what we are going through. And by that I mean fundamental change, not temporary. I think we will be operating at a higher level of savings for a lot of reasons. The low level of savings that we had as a nation was associated with rapidly appreciating real estate assets and rapidly appreciating portfolios of stocks. Because the average one of us, when we say how much you've got in savings, we don't just say, what have I got in a CD? You say, well, the value of my house has gone up 25% in the last 3 years. That's savings, that's wealth. Those have been squeezed down now. And so I don't think we will be relying on those potential paper profits for real estate, on equity loans, and equity values in our portfolios to the extent that we have. That it's going to be the old-fashioned kind of savings. And then, as I mentioned, because of the gender effects of the economic change, I sort of think that as we go forward, the phenomenon of two breadwinners in a household is probably going to be modified. There will not be as many of those. There'll still be a lot of them. The labor participation rate, which is the percentage of the adults in the population that work, that's going to go down. In other words, our world's going to be different. High savings means high investment when it's real savings. China's savings rate is 4 times ours on a per capita basis. In order for us to be a competitor in the global economy, I think it's got to be higher, and it will be. Another question? Yes, sir.
I was wondering about the increase in like what happens if the Fed doesn't claw back all that money that they have, and the banks do start lending that out. That'll create economic activity, but eventually the prices will catch up quickly, and then firms will realize that that's not real new activity, and then
yes,
that could cause another dip, right? I mean,
it would. I think you've summarized the potential situation quite well. So that, in a sense, what you have just described could be said, well, what else is new in America? That is, in America, we have what is called a credit cycle. Things get good, things boom, the Fed says, whoops, we got to slow this thing down. They run up the rates, we slow down. The Fed says, whoo, boy, they're really hurting, we got to juice it up. So we have a credit cycle. It's been going on for a long time. And so the high likelihood that we will have a credit cycle again. I think the crucial question is, soon will we make it through this recovery before we hit the need to slow down the economy? And that's the game they're playing. In a sense, the Fed is, for the first time in its history, is running a hedge fund. Federal Reserve Board is managing a hedge fund of over $1 trillion in junk bonds. So our Fed owns over $1 trillion in junk paper that they have bought, and that represents the other side of putting money in the economy. Then the question is, can they sell that paper, and will they sell that paper? They surely can. And when they sell it, what will be its value? They will probably make money, like many hedge fund operators, on their portfolio, but it is a game of timing, and it's hard to predict that. But you really put your finger on the risk, and I think you've made a safe forecast without putting a date on it, that we will see a credit cycle phenomenon again. But let's just hope that it's out there about 2012.
So what's the difference if
Yes.
it happens before the recovery's done, and if it happens after? Is it if it recover enough that there'll be enough new wealth in the economy to equal the amount of money that's out there,
Yes.
and you won't have to
That's
really
right.
do anything
That's
interesting?
Right. That's right. Because in a way there are two effects. There's Q and P in that equation. M goes up. Right now velocity is very low. M goes up. It's possible for P to go up by itself. It's possible for Q to go up by itself. Historically, P and Q go up. You get some real output, and you get some price effects. And so then it's a question of, do you get more price effect than Q effects. We'll get both, and it's a matter of time as to whether the Fed then causes us to truly have a W, whether the caterpillar dies, and we go back into a true recession following the Great Recession that we were coming out of. Yes, sir.
Briefly, Dr. you talked about housing.
Yes, sir.
And housing brought us into the situation we now find ourselves in.
Yes, sir.
Is it correct to say that there is still a huge overhang of overpriced or problem houses that individual or banks are holding, that until we get them off the books and appropriately priced, we're still going to have a big problem?
There's a lot of bank-owned real estate, a huge amount of bank-owned real estate. And, when we saw Nevada's the only state that is still labeled as being in recession, California is probably just real close borderline. Florida is borderline. If we look at the states that had the highest default level on mortgages, real estate-based mortgages, those states that I just mentioned would fall into that category. There are huge problems that remain out there. There's a lot of stuff on banks, balance sheets, including real estate owned, that has to wash out of the system. That problem is not over. I would say it's somewhat under control, but it's not over. Probably if you look at construction employment in the U.S., total construction employment, which of course has plummeted, and then you say, when would we see that come back? 5 years is what the profile looks like. So we're in a long recovery mode for the construction economy. I want to thank you for being here today. I know that a lot of people have all kinds of things they need to be doing, and a lot of people told me before that they were going to be bugging out of here. But please leave your questionnaires, and I guess you have something, an evaluation for. You'll leave those. Thank you for your support.
Brother actually has last week. Give us what he calls the